Great. Well, I'm very, very happy. We are very happy to welcome you in Pôle for this Ruskin conference. We've had a lot of obstacles, you and some of you on your way and so on, but everybody's more or less here. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But first of all, I'm very honored and very pleased that someone from the university who's in charge of training is here to welcome you in Pôle. And Frédéric Tesson is going to say a few words in French to welcome you.
Merci beaucoup. Je tenais d'abord à excuser le président de l'université, Mohamed Amara, qui est retenu à Bordeaux ce matin. Mais il a tenu vraiment à ce qu'un membre de l'équipe de direction vienne vous accueillir parce qu'il considère que c'est un moment important de l'université aussi. En plus, un laboratoire très jeune, Alter, qui vient de se constituer et c'est quelque chose qui est très important pour l'université. Il tenait vraiment à ce que quelqu'un qui participe à l'équipe de direction vienne vous accueillir. Et personnellement, je suis particulièrement heureux d'être là parce que, comme John Ruskin, je suis géographe. Parce que pour moi, en géographie, on croise de temps en temps John Ruskin, soit quand on travaille sur l'architecture, je travaille sur les problématiques d'urbanisme et d'aménagement, soit quand on travaille sur les questions de paysage. Et c'est vrai, c'est quelqu'un qu'on croise de temps en temps. Donc c'est particulièrement intéressant de voir qu'il y a un colloque ici sur John Ruskin. Alors j'avais préparé 3 petites choses pour dire que effectivement Laurence Roussillon-Constanti a publié un très bel article dans une revue géographique, la revue de géographie alpine, sur des problématiques plutôt paysagères. Et on a un docteur, un étudiant qui a fait sa thèse à Pau, qui a soutenu en 2007 et qui a fait un très bel article aussi sur les ambiances urbaines à Venise à partir de John Ruskin et Proust. Et c'est vrai que c'est quelqu'un qu'on croise et on se dit que peut-être il y aurait des choses à faire entre la géographie et les approches littéraires. Et c'est vrai que voilà. Donc je voulais vraiment, c'était vraiment important pour moi d'être là et je voulais vraiment vous accueillir, vous souhaiter de très très fructueux travaux. J'ai vu que vous allez vous promener, bénéficier des aménités paloises. Donc profitez bien en espérant que le temps reste au beau. Et donc je vais vous abandonner ce matin parce que je ne peux pas rester avec vous. Et j'espère que vous aurez de très beaux travaux et merci encore de ce travail. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Frédéric. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Well, so as you know, there are 3 of us organizing this conference. 2 from Pau and 1 from Bordeaux. Béatrice Laurent, who is here, and Fabienne Gaspari, who is too busy helping in the background, but I'm sure you've seen her already. And I'm Laurence Roussillon-Constanti. And I'm also the president of the SFEV, and I'd like, first of all, to send apologies from Fabienne Moine, who's my co-president, vice president, who is now in Pau, but in bed with the flu. So unfortunately, she can't be with us, at least today. Okay. But on behalf of the SFEV and the University of Pau, I'd first like to welcome you here and thank you for being here today to celebrate this bicentenary of John Ruskin's birth and reflect on the relevance of the writings today. We've co-organized this event with Béatrice in Bordeaux, and it's been a great thrill for us to have you respond so positively to our call for papers. Our engagement with Ruskin's writing is not new. In fact, back in 2007 or 6 even, Fabienne Gaspari and myself and Laurence Gasquet, who will be here tomorrow, published a translation of a selection of Ruskin's writings with the University of Pau. So it's kind of a return home for us. Béatrice Laurent, who has known Professor Landau for many a year, kindly suggested we invited him over for the conference, and we're very grateful she did. It was a great idea. As a scholar, Béatrice also worked and translated whole sections of the Victorian web in France, and we sort of worked on that years ago too. So basically, the common point between the 3 of us, apart from being French and living in the Southwest, and perhaps the common point between all of us here, is that somehow, at some point, Ruskin's name and ideas have resonated and been relevant to our perception of the world. In the next couple of days, as our event coincides with other companion events in Oxford or Venice, we hope that the multiple facets of Ruskin's writings come to light. Just like the wonderful silhouette that our graduate student Beatrice Martinez Souza designed for the conference posters, we expect Ruskin fleshes out and radiates with the many colors of your own gaze and views. No doubt, our three guest speakers, Professor Emily Eels, Jérôme Bassanelli, and Professor George Lando, will add new shades to the portrait, and we're very grateful to them for accepting our invitation to revisit Ruskin with us. Alongside this exciting program, we're able to design through your contributions. We'd like to also to mention that this two-day conference would not have been possible without the support of our institutions and partners. In Pôle, the research entity, newly born or from the merging of 3 different units, is called ALTER, headed by Hélène Laplace-Claverie, has been very generous to us, and we're very thankful to our colleagues who supported the project.
And in Bordeaux as well, the research lab to which I belong is called Climat, and on behalf of the president of Climat, that is Professor Nathalie Jaek, I'm very happy to come over here and represent Bordeaux Montaigne. And I thank all my students who've made such an effort to be here with us today. Thank you.
Yes, so this is a joint program, and I think the beginning of our collaboration within the Nouvelle-Aquitaine, which is the larger region. The regions in France have been redefined for 3 or 4 years now. Also, tomorrow we'll be at the Château, and Virginie Arboin has been a wonderful partner. She's meticulously and keenly been preparing our visit tomorrow. The Mairie de Pau has also been very generous and provided the gorgeous notebooks you'll find in your bags, and the bags are, from Bordeaux Montaigne, so it's really true partnership here. We'd like also, Fabienne Gaspari and myself would like to thank a number of people who've been instrumental here in Pau for planning the conference. People you have already met, Marie-Manuelle Marcos, Muriel Guyonneau, Valeria Lerouturu for the budget, and the sponsorship also. I know she helped us design all this, and Eden Martin for the conference tonight. We've also received a lot of informal help from unexpected quarters. Delia McGinty, Beatrice Martinez, again, who is a great graphic designer, and a dream team of students, Alexandra, Megan, Laetitia, Nadezhda, all of these faces you've already seen, people who've helped you yesterday, for instance. Several students have traveled from Bordeaux, which is also, so, please feel that you're also a bit at home here. You're in a different university, but feel comfortable here. I hope you've got your badges and you're all set now. And finally, I'd like to extend my thanks to 3 organizations that are close to my heart. The first one is the Guild of St. George for endorsing the event and sponsoring our conference as one of the numerous Ruskin celebrations planned out in 2019 and 2020. The second one is Jarvis, the International Association for Word and Image Studies, who also sponsored the event. And last but not least is naturally the SFEV and the members of the executive board who helped us throughout, Marie Terrier, our treasurer, Aurélien Vasilevsky, and Fabienne Moine, who will perhaps be here with us tomorrow and tell you more about the SFEV. I think I can now just wish you, a great 2 days. I hope, you'll enjoy this conference as much as we're expected to ourselves. Okay, and we'll start the first session with a change in chair, since Fabienne can't make it, and Beatrice will improvise, as she is great at doing that. So please, we'll welcome the first speakers. Thank you.
Well, I'm very, very happy, very pleased and honored to open the first session of this Ruskin conference this morning. This session is entitled On the Road, And indeed, we're going to embark on a journey with Ruskin. He's taking us on the road to social progress, but also very literally on his own roads, the ones that he built with his students in Oxford. Both roads leading us to a better Britain, perhaps a better future. Indeed, the first presentations consider Ruskin's interactions with the world in a very tangible way. His innovative planning projects and his education programs certainly contributed to improving people's lot, but with some of his writings denouncing social and economic inequalities, Ruskin also had very concrete objectives in mind. As a very pragmatic person, I also have to beware of the path that this conversation is going to take, especially to monitor the time. So we'll keep the question times to 15 minutes at the end of each speaker's time. So we'll try to stick to 25 minutes each. So I would first like to introduce Richard Hayes. Richard is an architect and an architectural historian. We met a few years ago at a very stimulating conference in Nantes, and his previous publications include the Yale Building Project, a 2007 comprehensive history of an influential educational program. He has published several articles and chapters on the aesthetic movement, particularly on Edward William Godwin, a progressive architect of the aesthetic movement inspired by Ruskin's writings on Venetian art and architecture. Today he's going to make another presentation associating his taste for history and his skills in architecture. His talk is about one of Ruskin's innovative but also progressive and democratic experiments, that of road digging. Richard's presentation is called Ruskin as Innovative Educator, the Road Building Project in Février Hinksey. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Good morning, bonjour. Could we darken the lights a little, please?
Yes.
As dark as possible. Okay. Maybe a little more, do you think?
You can see the screen beautifully.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
That's good. Okay, that's good. Thank you so much. Nothing could be more characteristic of contemporary trends in American education than the idea of combining learning with community service. Ever since the 1960s, college and university students have participated in educational programs that take them out of the classroom, away from their campus, and involve them in efforts focused on the common good. Building houses for poor families, mentoring inner-city youths, or clearing debris from parks wrecked by hurricanes are examples of some of the recent pedagogic initiatives by which today's students earn academic credit in courses that infuse higher education with civic engagement. In their combination of social do-goodism, learning by doing derived from the theories of John Dewey, and a pragmatist preference for problem solving over intellectual speculation, these courses might seem to embody characteristically American traits. An important precedent, however, for these courses is none other than an educational experiment that British sage John Ruskin organized in Victorian Oxford. In 1874, during his tenure as Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford, Ruskin asked undergraduates to help him build a road in a rural slum a few miles west of the university. The village of Février Hinksey was located between two rivers in low-lying terrain subject to flooding, which made it inaccessible. Although the actual road these Oxford students built eventually proved inadequate, it was an important learning experience in the lives of many of the participants who came to be known as Ruskin's road diggers. My paper places Ruskin's road building project in the context of its era, when it stands out as an innovative pedagogic experiment. In light of the conference theme of mediating Ruskin, I propose to read backwards from today's embrace of service-based learning in order to position Ruskin's 1874 efforts in Oxford as an important harbinger for breaking down boundaries between an elite university and its poor neighbors, between scholarship and manual labor, between art and social improvement. The project originated after Ruskin was elected honorary fellow of Corpus Christi College in 1871, and he would take lengthy walks through the countryside surrounding Oxford, in particular down to Abingdon and west through the Hinkseys. Do we have a pointer? As stated, Ferry Hinksey, today North Hinksey, was liable to flooding, which not only isolated its inhabitants, but also led to serious sanitary problems. Both the village and the city of Oxford were struck by a cholera epidemic in 1854. Consequently, Ruskin conceived of the idea of engaging his students to improve the landscape in Ferry Hinksey to mitigate these environmental and health problems when he began his second term as Slade professor. Funded by a grant from the Paul Mellon Center, I recently retraced Ruskin's steps along the 2-mile walk from Christchurch to Hinksey. Today, the remaining thatched roof cottages are charming, and it is hard to imagine they were once hovels. Crossing the Thames along with its tributaries, one is reminded how riverine Oxford is. As travel writer Jan Morris has written, there are bits and pieces of the Thames all over Oxford, runnels and reaches and backwaters. The ferryman is the oldest of Oxford figures. The ferry across the Cherwell at Marston was in continuous use from the 13th century until the 1970s. And the professional river fisherman crops up in every medieval archive of the city. The early inhabitants of Oxford must have considered themselves river people, like Mississippi mudlarks, and the very names of the western districts, Osney, Bisney, and Hinksey, recall old island settlements in the swamp. While picturesque, the riparian surroundings of the Hinkseys posed important health problems in the mid-19th century. And Ruskin's friend, Henry Ackland, Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford, had included the village in his study of the cholera epidemic, along with suggestions for improving rural sanitation. Consequently, the condition of villages like Ferry Hinksey was of topical interest. And it was, in fact, in a letter to Ackland in 1874 that Ruskin gave his most thorough description of his intentions in the project. He wrote, "I want to show my Oxford drawing class my notion of what a country road should be. I am always growling and howling about rails, and I want them to see what I would have instead, beginning with a quiet byroad through villages. Now, I don't know in all of England a lovelier sight of road than the land along the foothills past Ferry Hinksey, and I want Mr. Harcourt's leave to take up the bit of it immediately to the south of the village and bring it this spring into the prettiest shape I can. I want to level 1 or 2 bits where the water lodges, to get the ruts out of the rest, and sow the banks with the wildflowers that ought to grow on them. And this I want to do with delicatest touching, putting no rough workmen on the ground, but keeping all loveliness it has. That is my first, not my chief object. My chief object is to let my pupils feel the pleasures of useful, muscular work, and especially of the various and amusing work involved in getting a human pathway rightly made through a lovely country and rightly adorned." Accordingly, during Trinity term 1874, about 12 undergraduates took up Ruskin's challenge and set out from Oxford to begin the project. Their numbers would later swell to over 50. Ruskin's elderly gardener, David Downs, served as supervisor. The core group of volunteers was composed of men from Balliol, one of the more intellectual and progressive colleges. It included Arnold Toynbee, the future economic historian, who would rise to become foreman of the diggers. The following fall, a new student from Magdalen joined the volunteers, Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. An enthusiast for Ruskin's lectures on Florentine art, Wilde later claimed to have been granted the distinction of being allowed to fill Mr. Ruskin's especial wheelbarrow. As Richard Ellman wrote, it was not much of a road, but for Wilde, it was the road to Ruskin, who invited his sweaty workers to breakfast in Christchurch after their exertions. According to another of the student participants, Hardwick Rawnsley, the original idea was to mend the ferry path across the Vale, but when this proved too ambitious, the focus shifted to improving an unpaved road that bordered the village green. To unpaved road that bordered the village green. Since this was so full of ruts and depressions, villagers would take their carts across the green, defacing it in the process. Rawnsley stated, "A more untidy, hopeless-looking village green I had not seen in Merry England when we began upon the mending of the road that bordered it." And that's carts going across the green instead of the road. The novelty of the episode attracted attention, and visiting the site to watch the Oxford gentlemen in their straw boaters acting as laboring navvies became a popular outing. Unfamiliar with handling shovels and pickaxes, the undergraduates became the subject of ridicule, as seen in this illustration from June 1874, with its pointed contrast of industrious student laborers and layabout villages or day trippers. After the first year of enthusiastic digging, however, the novelty of the effort wore off and the number of participants dwindled, although Ruskin was himself on site nearly every day during Michaelmas term 1874. Digging continued until April of 1875, and in May, the project effectively came to an end. One contemporary, G.W. Kitchen, described the condition of the road as he found it a year later. A mile or so of road was laid out. It led to nowhere in particular, unless it had been intended to lead to a comely farm on the hillside, and even then it did not reach. The road showed obvious signs of decay. No prudent farmer would have brought his cart over it. So what are we to make of this episode? Ruskin's intentions for the project, as outlined in his letter to Ackland, were manifold, if not contradictory. Such an unstable admixture of intentions could only prove problematic. Leaving aside the question of the success or failing of the project, I would like to sketch out a few contexts for interpreting the episode. Primarily, the road digging project was an educational experiment, an attempt to introduce active engagement into the university along with a critique of prevailing social structures. As Tim Hilton has noted, one of Ruskin's themes was that undergraduates need not be bound to their college tutors and the mechanical demands of a curriculum. The project disrupted the students' normal and expected routines with a dramatic displacement of their bodies. From the city of Oxford to a rural village, from the lecture halls and tutors' chambers at England's premier university to an open-air website. Ruskin's unconventional tactics as educator were focused on the value of learning by direct experience. Commuting between Oxford and Ferry Hinksey, leaving aside their books for shovels and wheelbarrows, the students experienced firsthand the difference between mental and manual work. Clearly, Ruskin wanted the students to experience what he called in another context the fraternity of toil, in which cooperation would replace competition. In line with his unorthodox method for achieving this was the fact that the project was secular and not conducted under the auspices of religious duty. Ruskin had undergone a religious unconversion in 1858, and while remaining staunchly committed to the moral values of the Gospels, he never portrayed the episode in religious terms. Writing 20 years ago, art historian Timothy Barringer analyzed the project in light of Victorian concerns with masculinity and manual labor. Accordingly, he alluded to Ford Madox Brown's painting Work, 1852-65, with its depiction of navvies building a tunnel underneath a road in Hampstead. Important to Barringer's interpretation was the following comment by Wilde. It seemed to Ruskin wrong that all the best physique and strength of young men in England should be spent aimlessly on cricket ground or river without any real result at all. He thought, he said, that we should be working at something that would do good to other people, at something by which we might show that in all labor there was something noble. Ruskin rejected the cult of athleticism that began to take hold in Oxford and in Britain's public schools. This was the era in which Oxford was extending itself in huge parcels of land for undergraduate sports. Ruskin's project may thus be understood as a critique of the university's new emphasis on sporting culture. Francis O'Gorman has recently suggested that Ruskin disagreed with the dominant modes of normative masculinity. In light of this, it is important to note the complex gender implications in Ruskin's own description of the scheme. He repeatedly used terms like lovely, pretty, and delicate in describing the planned country road, the banks of which were to be sown with wildflowers in order to be rightly adorned. He wanted his students to feel the pleasures of useful manual work. If this is the construction of an oppositional mode of masculinity, it is one with a strong aesthetic component. His position here would seem to anticipate the aesthetic movement that would flourish in the 1880s. Also intrinsic to Ruskin's understanding of masculinity was an emphasis on the responsibilities of stewardship. The landowners of Ferry Hinksey had allowed their tenants to live in hovels with poor sanitation, subject to epidemics, and the road building project would form an exemplary exercise in the proper maintenance of an Oxfordshire village. The rural setting of the project was important and has wide implications. Can the episode be viewed as adhering to the pastoral tradition, in which the countryside was understood as the locus of retreat for worldly characters seeking insight? As the cartoon in the graphic had suggested, there was a humorous element to the reversal of social structure in the Oxford episode, not unlike the reversals of identity that occur in Shakespeare's comedies As You Like It or Twelfth Night. Ruskin's band of Oxford gentlemen acting as navvies may suggest the disguised characters in Shakespeare's comedies, and the episode was one in which a natural setting witnessed the temporary overturning of social hierarchy. The play acting side of the experiment must have appealed to the young Wilde. Furthering the significance of the rural setting, the episode bears an ambivalent relationship to the natural landscape movement in Britain. As Barry Bergdahl has noted, the verdant settings of the British landscape garden allowed a freedom from conventions and fostered the development of aesthetic experiments that included the picturesque movement. In the course of the 18th century, garden designers saw the natural landscape as a laboratory in which to explore ideas related to the sensationalist and empirist philosophy of John Locke, the Earl of Shaftesbury, and Joseph Addison. The natural landscape was perceived as the place where human nature could be best understood. Ruskin's creation of an educational experiment in a rural setting encapsulates the idea that the natural landscape is the school for youth. Nevertheless, as John Dixon Hunt has pointed out, Ruskin was opposed to the picturesque for the touristic mentality that had developed by the 19th century. Roving bands of observers seeking in contrived landscapes purely visual thrills without moral or ethical engagement. Consequently, a practical-minded effort to improve a degraded landscape acted as a pointed rejection of that side of the picturesque movement that fostered superficial sightseeing. In fact, the picturesque had developed a set of visual rules that sought to banish views of manual laborers. So perhaps Ruskin's most radical proposition in the project may have been to give the aesthetic and the ethical equal weight. He wanted both a rightly adorned pathway and an ethical experience in which students could contribute usefully to an impoverished community. These intentions, though, were never resolved, and the task proved more demanding than originally expected. The road was left unfinished. In its final state as a fragment, it may unintentionally coincide with the picturesque preference for ruins. Does the unfinished state of the project mean that it was a failure? It does suggest that Ruskin's view of manual labor was quixotic, if not naive. He underestimated the inevitable drudgery, boredom, and repetitive nature of most forms of manual labor. This is something student Hardwick Rawnsley grasped, as he later confessed. I learned then much of the monotony of navvy work and something of its fatigue. Oscar Wilde could draw from his own experience at Ferry Hinksey when 16 years later, in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, he stated, I cannot help saying that a great deal of nonsense is being written and talked nowadays about the dignity of manual labor. There is nothing necessarily dignified about manual labor at all, and most of it is absolutely degrading. Ruskin's own contact with actual laborers, the Irish masons who worked on the Oxford Natural History Museum, was not a success. But the failure of the project had a larger context. As a group effort involving up to 50 students, and which took place over the course of several academic terms, it needed more organizational structure than Ruskin's part-time oversight and the presence of his personal gardener. The failure of the project may not have been in its idealism or in the inexperience of the student laborers, but in the lack of institutional support from Oxford. Ruskin seems to have acknowledged this when in September 1876 he wrote in his journal, How I shall give it them this year, the masters, for not helping me at Hinksey, masters of art, inertia. Ruskin was disillusioned by Oxford's failure to support his scheme, a refusal that might seem to have been due to the university's embrace of its ancient traditions. But there are other reasons. For in the second half of the 19th century, Oxford was already undergoing numerous reforms. Mark Pattison, rector of Lincoln College, Benjamin Jowett of Balliol, and philosopher Thomas Hill Green were prominent educational leaders interested in reshaping the university. Pattison, for example, sought to introduce the German model of scholarly specialization as a way to modernize Oxford. Although personally friendly with Ruskin, he had a particular dislike of public intellectuals with wide-ranging interests. Ruskin's road-building project occurred during an era of numerous reforms at the university, some of which may have made a stronger case for institutional attention. Even if an immediate failure, the project may be placed on a continuum of social engagement that leads to today. Arnold Toynbee, one of the diggers, combined a scholarly career at Oxford with efforts to alleviate poverty in London. After his early death, at age 30, his colleagues founded Toynbee Hall in Whitechapel in his honor. The hall was the center of the settlement movement in the 1880s and 90s, when Oxbridge students lived among the poor in London's East End, performing social work and teaching extension classes. The settlement movement then spread to America at the end of the 19th century, as institutions like Hull House in Chicago and the Grand Street Settlement in New York were founded along the lines of Toynbee Hall. By the 20th century, the settlement movement made inroads in Appalachia, one of America's poorest rural regions, where, curiously enough, during the 1960s, students from elite American universities performed volunteer work that included road mending and improvements to rural sanitation. If the line of affiliation between today's courses and Ferry Hinksey is tenuous, it is nevertheless a real one. The prevalence of service-based learning in contemporary universities shows the extent to which Ruskin's ideas have entered the fabric of our own culture. Thank you.
I think maybe it's best if we save question time for the end of the session, because otherwise not everybody's going to have their due time. So please, if you would like Chiaki to use that chair and get ready. Yes? Do you need this? Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Richard. And while we are getting ready, it is my pleasure to welcome Chiaki Yokoyama. Chiaki is professor at the Faculty of Law at Keio University in Japan. Her current research interests lie in the education of the Victorian working class and the interrelationship between art and community. In 2018, she published a book in Japanese on Ruskin, whose title in French is whose title in English, is John Ruskin and Working Class Education. Chiaki is a companion of Ruskin's Guild of St. George, as many of our speakers are also in this room. I'm thinking about Sarah and Rachel and Laurence and George as well. So we have many representatives of the Guild of St. George in this assembly. This proves that Ruskin's work and ideas live on and radiate in today's world beyond British borders. What Chiaki's paper is about Ruskin's, again, educational and artistic involvement at the Working Men's College. So we'll be looking at a different aspect of Ruskin's involvement with teaching and the subsequent influence he had on the furnishings and decorative manufacture firm of William Morris. Her paper is entitled Connecting Artists and Artisans, John Ruskin, the Working Men's College, and Morris and Company.
The idea of the Working Men's College, the first comprehensive adult education institution in the world established in 1854, began with a series of meetings organized by barrister John Malcolm Ludlow, the newly appointed chaplain of Lincoln's Inn, and the Christian socialist Frederick Denison Morris soon joined Ludlow, and shortly afterwards, famous others such as Charles Kingsley, and the last one, the light on the top, Thomas Hughes, and Frederick James Furnival followed. They formed a society for promoting Working Men's Association and built the Hall of Association, where classes and lectures were offered to working men and women. These activities led to the foundation of the Working Men's College with Morris as its principal. In May 1854, the founding members held a discussion on what subject they should offer, in which music and drawing had been already listed. At this stage, they would never have thought to ask John Ruskin, the renowned art critic, to join their teaching staff. Instead, Furnival, who had already developed a friendship with Ruskin, sent a circular hoping to get his patronage. To their surprise, Ruskin offered to teach a drawing class at the college himself. There would be several reasons for Ruskin to wish to try his hand at teaching working class students. One of them is that college gave him an opportunity to justify his criticism against the government's educational program, the central figure of which were Henry Cole, and Richard Redgrave. They tried to introduce an educational system, the National Course of Instruction, or South Kensington system, which was the official art training scheme. The National Course of Instruction was rigid, mechanistic course, emphasizing manual dexterity for purely utilitarian purposes. It followed printed example of flat diagram in hard outlines. Students were instructed to copy them diligently, and instead of natural object, they used ornamental casts. Competitions, prizes, and examinations also played an important role in the system. Some of the students who took drawing classes at the Workingmen's College were taught according to the government system, and the college expected to keep its ties with the government school since it lacked the ample facilities necessary for conducting drawing classes. Ruskin effectively cut this supposed tie. Joining the faculty, Ruskin provided the college with specially made highly quality drawing paper, easels, and all sorts of materials. Furthermore, he made arrangement for a third-floor studio to be available to students. He also donated to the library a variety of books of all genres, including quite a few volumes of art books, and to the college museum, a collection of minerals which could be used in his drawing class. His book, The Element of Drawing, published in 1857, was written based on his teaching at the college. In the book, he condemned the methodology of the government schools, observing that they were, quote, all too much in the habit of confusing art as applied to manufacture with manufacture itself, unquote. He also asserted that good design cannot be created by merely copying or imitating good design. At the Workingmen's College, he focused on teaching to see. The skill of drawing was, for Ruskin, to develop the sight, the ability to look at things properly. Ruskin's approach to teaching focused on developing individual talent, since he was strongly against the notion of competition and examination. In Ruskin's class, students were made to draw from natural objects. He carefully chose a different object for each student, and instead of starting with the outline, Ruskin made students first pay attention to local color and shade. While the government school made the students carry out such exercises by following the order of outline, shade, and color, Ruskin put mass first, color next, and details afterwards. Another of Ruskin's reasons for joining the college was to introduce young artists to an environment in which they could learn while teaching. Before opening the college, he had already asked Dante Gabriel Rossetti on the left, a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and his recent protege, to join him at college. Rossetti joins Ruskin's class as an instructor, and in the end of January 1855, he started teaching a figure class separately. Eventually, the scheme of drawing classes took shape. First, students learned the basic of drawing from Ruskin, and were then passed to the landscape class taught by Lord Dickinson, one of the founding members of the college, and finally learned color and figure drawing from Rossetti. Teaching at the college was satisfying as well as inspirational for Rossetti. Soon, he introduced other pre-Raphaelite-related members into the college. First, the sculptor Thomas Ulner and Alexander Moreau took up modeling classes in 1855, and later in 1858, Ford Madox Brown in the center, and who was the painter of the label of the picture. He took over Rossetti's class when Rossetti became busy. Edward Van Jones, on the right, joined to help Brown, and later in 1859 started his own class. Val Prinsep, William K. Thomas, and Arthur Hughes followed as instructors of drawing classes, and the other pre-Raphaelite affiliates sometimes visited Ruskin's classes, where they were challenged by Ruskin himself to demonstrate their ability in front of the students. The college administration gave Ruskin a free hand to conduct drawing classes, which continued to be one of the most popular courses in the college curriculum. Ruskin, in his turn, gave autonomy to the young artists when they taught their classes. Still, all of those artists shared Ruskin's and the pre-Raphaelite's principle, that is, to draw only after or from nature. As long as the students understood this founding principle, they could develop their talents and abilities according to the various methods which the young artist offered in the class. While condemning government schemes focusing on applied art, Ruskin, however, did not intend to exclude the whole sphere of design. In the elements of drawing, Ruskin insisted, as quoted in the item 1 on the handout, that we should try first to manufacture a Raphael, then let Raphael direct your manufacture, and then leave your trained artist to determine how far art can be popularized or manufactured ennobled, unquote. Also, many draftsmen and artists emerged from his students at the college, some of whom, such as George Allen and William Ward, became indispensable in the compilation of Ruskin's published works. Design was also an important element of aesthetic interests of young artists teaching at the Working Men's College. As early as 1857, with Rossetti's suggestion, Burne-Jones and his friend William Morris joined the mural project to decorate the wall of the Oxford Union, only to find their lack of skill at fresco painting. This exercise must have made them realize the importance of a first-hand knowledge of decorative art. In the same year, Rossetti received a commission for designs of stained glass windows from James Powell and Sons, a famous stained glass manufacturer. The Church Building Act in 1818 and the religious revival movement from the 1830s had opened a lucrative market for stained glass. Still, most of the designs were taken or copied from the works of past master painters. Manufacturers needed original drawings to produce stained glass for their own time. Rossetti passed that commission to Burne-Jones, who produced his first design in 1857. In the same year, Brown also started providing cartoons for Powell's. While teaching at the college, Burne-Jones and Brown kept offering cartoons of stained glass and improving their skill of this draft or craft. Also, former members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, after the original Brotherhood dissolved, founded the Hogarth Club in April 1858. This club consisted not only of artist members but also of non-artist members who supported the club as patrons. Members included Brown, Rossetti, Ulner, William Holman Hunt, Burne-Jones, and William Morris. By the end of the year, Ruskin became a non-artist member of the club. Juxtaposed with pictures in the exhibitions were many pieces of furniture and stained glass cartoons designed by the members. Although the club dissolved in 1861, its initial success surely paved the way for the establishment of a commercial enterprise of connecting arts and crafts. The Working Men's College was one of the important cobblestones to pave its way. We find that, according to the first annual report of the college, quite a few students were engaged in the crafts and decorative art listed as decorators. While instructing them to draw after nature, teachers must have learned how to adapt their drawing skills to decorative design, and the students how to adapt what they learned to their professional skills. Eventually, Rossetti, Burne-Jones, and Brown started planning to establish a decorative art manufacturing firm with William Morris, Philip Webb, Peter Paul Marshall, and Charles Faulkner. In 1859, they experienced a new form of brotherhood by building the Red House for Morris and his new bride, Jane Burding, from scratch. They also designed and made furniture for the house. This camaraderie led to the plans for the new firm, Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company. Probably this new scheme and their interest in decorative design may have influenced their teaching at the college. Glass painting was one of the major productions Burne-Jones and Brown had already been actively engaged in, and one for which the future firm was to receive a formidable numbers of orders. Rossetti, like Ruskin, stuck to drawing from nature and forbade his students to make a firm outline. A student, Thomas Salmon, remembered that he strongly opposed not only outline but also drawing from imagination, as quoted in item 2 on the handout. Brown's approach, on the other hand, was totally different from Rossetti's. Unlike Rossetti, Brown insisted on a firm outline. J.P. Emsley, one of the students of drawing classes who later became an instructor of the drawing class himself, expressed his initial perplexity at the teaching of Brown's, as you can see in item 3 on the handout. Here, however, Brown might have explored new decorative methods of glass painting in emphasizing outline and measurement or proportion. Those students had already been trained in the effects of mass and shade by Ruskin and in the effect of color by Rossetti and the credo of drawing from nature. Now, by focusing on outline and introducing measurement of proportion, Brown might have been exploring the possibility of adapting their drawing skills as well as his own to glass painting design. In January 1859, Edward Burne Jones, who had been assisting in Brown's class, became an instructor of the separate drawing class. By then, Burne Jones had already produced quite a few cartoons for stained glass. Before and around this year, the terms such as glass painter and glass stainer started to appear as the occupation of the students listed in the ledger of the college. According to Amer Valance's biography of William Morris, as quoted in item 4 on the handout, Burne Jones had projected a course on glass painting at the Workingmen's College, which was not realized though. As we can rightly imagine, the college was a place where the future firm could recruit new professional members supporting its founders. The current Workingmen's College possessed a notice which was considered to have been posted around January 1862. It reads, "Wanted by a firm of decorative artists and glass painters, a young man able to draw and wishing to improve himself, for which he would have unusual opportunities. Any student of the drawing classes of the college who thinks that the situation might suit him is requested to apply to Mr. Rossetti in his classroom on Monday, January 27, or on Monday, February 3rd, between the hours of 9 and 10 p.m. The firm mentioned here is, of course, the Morris, Marshall, and Faulkner Company, which was set up in the spring of the previous year. Actually, the firm had already hired one of the students at the college, George Campfield, who was a glass painter and a student with drawing classes at the Workingmen's College, was considered to offer much-needed professional knowledge to the firm. Morris first encountered Campfield at the college and hired him as the foreman of the firm in March 1861 before its opening. According to an interview printed on the Pall Mall Gazette, part of which you can see in item 5 on the handout, Campfield first took the drawing class of Ruskin. While Campfield was drawing a fig leaf from plaster cast, Ruskin came, holding up his drawing and said, quote, "I cannot teach you more than this. You must now study under another master," unquote. In the registry of the Workingmen's College recorded that Campfield entered the college in the first term of the 5th year, starting on October 28, 1858. From this term, Brown took over Rossetti's drawing class. Probably Campfield's reputation was shared with Ruskin and the founders of the firm who were teaching at the college. Interestingly, the ledger of the college, it's on the right, recorded in the next term, March 1859, a certain Webb entered the college as a student, paying matriculation fee on March 14th and obviously taking a drawing class which would start on March 18th. If we refer to the registry on the left, we could find the student Webb is A. Philip Webb, who was an architect registered by the address number 7, Great Ormond Street. Here we find that this is none other than Philip Webb, who was the designer of the Red House, opened his office at the number 7 Great Ormond Street in May 1859, and later became one of the founding members of the Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company in 1861. Webb's name appeared this once either in registry or the ledger. It can be inferred that the motives of Philip Webb was to test the proficiency of Campfield, as Valance mentioned in the item 4 of the handout, and find other talent among the classmates for the future firm, as well as to brush up his ability to draw under the great master Ruskin himself. And as I have mentioned before, many artists of the pre-Raphaelite circle visited drawing classes at the college and were challenged by Ruskin to paint certain specimens for the class. The Workingmen's College was an institution to educate not only artisans, but also artists. At the same time, the college introduced several talents, such as Campfield. By the end of the 1861, at least one student at the college was hired by the firm, Albert Goodwin, who later became a watercolor painter whose work were highly praised by Ruskin. Ruskin kept teaching at the Working Men's College on and off until 1862. Also, Rossetti left the college after the term, which ended on March 10, 1862. Although the Working Men's College network of artists constructed by those two eventually dissolved, its influence is very apparent in the development of later aesthetic movement. Through these activities of the Working Men's College, drawing and design, and artists and artisans came to be strongly linked, thereby providing an important conduit into the new era of arts and crafts. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie. Our third speaker is going to be Jean-Yves Tizot from the University of Grenoble-Alpes. Jean-Yves is a senior lecturer in contemporary British history at the Department of Foreign Languages and Culture. His research is mainly in economic and social history and in the history of ideas as well. His interests lie in the topics relating to inequality and poverty, social and urban policy. For example, the intellectual foundations of Howard's Garden City program. His recent interests also lie in the ideology of development and post-development, as well as the questions of town planning and utopia. In this respect, he kindly agreed to organize last year's session on revolutions and utopia at the SEV workshop in Nanterre. He edited a collection of articles following this conference that will be published along with an introduction in the next volume of Les Cahiers Victoriens et Édouardiens, which is the organ of this association, this society, this FEV. He edited a collection of articles and also has published extensively on social and historical subjects. Today, Jean-Yves is going to present a paper on one of Ruskin's most influential and radical essays, that is, Unto This Last. And to do this, he's going to illustrate how Ruskin's work was and still is politically and ideologically exploited, and it is used to support very different, even sometimes antagonistic, worldviews. So this paper is entitled From Social Catholicism to Degrowth, on the only two French translations of John Ruskin's Unto This Last.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm trying to get settled. I have a problem with my glasses, so I'll try and stay the right distance here. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. This very interesting conference on Ruskin here. My paper is entitled On the Only Two Translations of Ruskin's Unto This Last, and it's remarkable that in many other countries there are only very rare translations of Ruskin's Unto This Last. One researcher's conclusion is often the starting point of another's investigation, and in the present case, I began questioning the scarcity of French translations of Ruskin's Unto This Last, in particular after reading an abstract of a conference talk on the positive translations into French of Ruskin's political, social, and economic writings in general. Unto This Last, a collection of 4 critical essays on political economy, the dominant economic doctrine until the so-called marginal revolution of the second half of the 19th century took off. Unto This Last was, for a very long time, the only one of Ruskin's works, with perhaps the exception of Sesame and Lilies, which had attracted enough attention in the land of baguette, camembert, and vin rouge to be the object of a translation in the language, if not the register, of Gérard Depardieu. I thought the contrast would be illuminating. Perhaps I thought that status of exception would be interesting to look into, as it might reveal some or something of the possible reasons for the general scarcity of recent French language versions of Ruskin's social thought. When Bénédicte Coste gave her talk, that's my inspiration for this, the beginning here, when she gave a talk entitled The Strange Case of John Ruskin, or How French Translations Have Forgotten His Political and Social Thought. Forgotten with inverted commas, of course. The latest and only second French version at that time of On to This Last had apparently not yet been published. So she was looking at a landscape of late 19th and early 20th century translations of Ruskin's work, apart from her own Sept lampes de l'architecture published in 2011. Many of these translations were only fragments, extracts which sometimes were recast into a new, often distorting frame that could best serve the translator's purposes. And here I'm thinking in particular of the Christian socialists. In the article that followed the talk, Bénédicte Coste showed that the nigh-on-exclusive focus on the art critic and his flamboyant, inimitable, idiosyncratic style had led to a relative but almost absolute neglect towards what we can call Ruskin's social thought or social ideas. To be more precise, the article that she wrote after her talk, No Disciple of Mine, One Stage in the Reception of John Ruskin in France, that's Mantras, half the title was in French, so I translated it into English. Bénédicte Coste discerned two dominant tendencies that shaped the reception of Ruskin's ideas in France. The first one, of course, which I've just mentioned, is the exclusive interest for the art critic and the artistic personality of Ruskin. In this vein, the best-known translations are those of the Belgian playwright and poet Émile Camartz, who is also known as a translator of Chesterton's Father Brown stories into French. He translated parts of modern painters in 1914, for example. A couple of his translations were prefaced by Robert de la Cizerane, himself the author, in 1897, of a classic study in French, Ruskin and the Religion of Beauty, Ruskin et la religion de la beauté. In this context, Ruskin's contribution is often, more often than not, reduced to that of a conflicted and tormented literary and artistic genius who formulated an aesthetic and social religion, not primarily the author of a profound critique of the unequal regime of accumulation and destruction of his time and times to come, according to other views. However, the social and political dimensions are not altogether absent in this perspective. That would be difficult when dealing with Ruskin. But they are mostly seen as idiosyncratic, eccentric, if not utterly cranky attempts at dabbling in social, political, and economic ideas by an incompetent amateur, an exalted preacher, in the words of one commentator, or even a sectarian aesthete. Conversely, the second approach to Ruskin's work concentrates mainly on his social and political ideas, and most authors in this perspective essentially seek to instrumentalize these ideas, as well as Ruskin's literary and art-related prestige, for the promotion of the social reform agenda of the well-to-do bourgeoisie. It was this sort of ideas that presided, for example, over the creation of the Fondation Universitaire de Belleville in 1899 by Jacques Bardou, a Ruskin scholar, French Ruskin scholar, who tried to emulate in France the initiatives of Arnaud Toynbee, himself a Ruskin disciple, in the vein that Richard was talking about early on, in the field of popular education too. This bias was continued and amplified in the following decades in France and Britain alike. In France, the solidarist and social economy movement, inspired by Charles Gide before the First World War, was prolonged and carried over into the interwar period and represented a continuation of sorts of Ruskin's social thought. In this context, Ruskin's social and political ideas were often, if not always, interpreted as a theoretical basis or an inspiration for the progressive social work and education projects of the new liberal, beginning of the 20th century, bourgeoisie, of which moral action, people nowadays would say advocacy, and the enlightenment of the masses form the main part. The differential reception and dissemination of Ruskin's aesthetic and artistic work on the one hand, and of his social and economic ideas on the other hand, followed a similar split pattern in Britain and France, it appears. This certainly reflects the dual nature of Ruskin's work and thought, and is in a way not surprising. What is surprising is that the continuity between these two aspects, which Ruskin himself made very clear a number of times, was not what attracted most of the readers' and commentators' attention, who seemed mainly fascinated by their difference, the difference between these two aspects, which they interpreted as a polar divergence of Ruskin's interests. Strangely, only Bardou, who was one of the main proponents of an interpretation of Ruskin as a benevolent bourgeois Catholic social reformer, whose ideas could help men and women of goodwill in the fight against the worst excesses of capitalism, Bardou was the only author who really took an interest in both aspects, art and political aspects, and who insisted on the continuity between them. I want to skip over a little bit to a general presentation of Onto This Last. I wanted to suppose that most of the audience here would know about Onto This Last, but I don't think I can do that. The uproar against Ruskin and his essays started as soon as the first one, The Roots of Honour, came out in the Cornhill magazine, published by William Thackeray. In this, Ruskin expressed very directly his extremely critical views on what he contemptuously termed the soi-disant science of political economy. Expressed in the florid language typical of the master art critic, Ruskin's assessment of the new gospel of wealth that was the dominant economic doctrine of the time could, to a hasty reader, pass for the clever musings and wordplays of a great literary mind, and it has often been too easily dismissed by economists in particular as the politically inept ramblings of an art critic out of his depth in a discussion of economic questions. In fact, right from the start, Ruskin's critique reaches to the very heart of the epistemological weaknesses of the economic science or sciences and debunks the claims of the dismal science to realism and scientificity as essentially empty posturing and false pretenses. Essay 1, The Roots of Honour, opens with the following words. Among the delusions which at different periods have possessed themselves of the minds of large masses of the human race, perhaps the most curious, certainly the least creditable, is the modern soi-disant science of political economy, based on the idea that an advantageous code of social action may be determined irrespectively of the influence of social affections. Of course, as in the instances of alchemy, astrology, witchcraft, and other such popular creeds, political economy has a plausible idea at the root of it. Of course, right after this, Ruskin denied that political economy had any realistic claim to explaining or justifying the inequalities that prevailed at the time. One other aspect that I want to insist on about Ruskin's Onto This Last is that he also made a number of proposals in Onto This Last and had a reform program, mainly in 4 points that can be summarized as follows. First, he proposed the setting up of government schools at government cost. Secondly, state-run factories and workshop, also at government cost. Thirdly, a public service for the management of the unemployed through education, work placement, and for recalcitrant individuals, forced labour with delayed wages. And lastly, comfort and home should be provided for the old and destitute at the expense of the local or national community, depending on the value of previous services rendered. The 4 essays deal with the true definition of wealth, of prices and cost of labour, the idea of utility as part of the value, among other economic concepts. But at the root of all value is human life, according to Ruskin, honesty and a sense of social responsibility that should be proportional to the material wealth of individuals. A strong rejection of the transformation of workers into machines is one of Ruskin's main ideas onto this last. Now onto the two translations. I reproduced here the titles and the references. The first one is the first French translation of Onto This Last came out in 1902 under its English title, 40 years after the publication of the 4 essays in book form in 1862. The translation itself was the work of Émile Pelletier, an abbot, who the following year founded the Catholic Esperantist review Espero Catholica. Not surprisingly, the introduction by Henriette and Jean Brune, both prominent social Catholics, extols Ruskin's vigorous indictment of the pseudoscience of political economy and insists that they reflected Ruskin's religious beliefs, more specifically, the social doctrine of the church. The can't call them the Brunes, but the Brunesses also, it's Brunes in French. The Brunes also remarked, of course, on the lifelong influence of the Old and New Testament on Ruskin's thought and its evolution, and quoted a passage from Force Clavicula where Ruskin warns the sons and daughters of England that they should choose between Christ and Adam Smith, between John Stuart Mill and the prophets. Clearly, the religious and in particular the social Catholic aspect of Ruskin's critique of political economy is the fulcrum of the Brunesses' interpretation. Remarkably, the next translation into French only appeared in 2012, 110 years after the first one, and this time the attention and interest came from an apparently very different quarter. The translators, Pierre Thiessé and Quentin Thomasé, are collaborators of the French degrowth movement. Pierre Thiessé writes in the quarterly review La Décroissance. In his editor's notes, which is really the introduction of this version, he insists on Ruskin's rejection of overproduction, overconsumption, luxury, planned obsolescence, among other evils of advanced capitalist economies. Thiessé situates Ruskin within a long line of critics of development or progress, understood as growth, as the industrial production of material artifacts and the technological expansion and acceleration of that production process, leading to the incremental accumulation and destruction of so-called goods, and the ever-increasing consumption of services. In this perspective, Ruskin is considered as one of many precursors of degrowth. Because they do not spring from the same worldviews, the two interpretations obviously differ or diverge on a number of points. But more than a century apart, they share some essential common points, as I will show briefly. Both approaches share the common observation in particular that Ruskin was fundamentally outraged by socio-economic inequalities and poverty in the midst of plenty, and by the waste of both material resources and human life. Based on an understanding that Ruskin's complex and possibly conflicted thought was always likely to lend itself to various and sometimes mutually contradictory readings, I want to share with you the results of comparing and contrasting the two interpretations. And this might help to find some of the reasons for the very small numbers of translations of Onto This Last into French over more than 150 years. Back to the first version, this is my copy from the Institut Catholique de Toulouse, 1902. As you can see, it's the cover has a subtitle, Il n'y a de richesse que la vie, there is no wealth but life, which appears in section 77 in Ad Valorem. And the inside title page has a translation of the phrase Onto This Last, Il n'y a de richesse que la vie. Where am I here? Oh, sorry, it's, the second page. Of Onto This Last, sorry, in brackets, Même à ce dernier, from the parable of the workers in the vineyard. The publisher is Gabriel Beauchesne and Company, a house founded just the year before in 1901. Beauchesne and Company were one of the main publishers for the Society of Jesus, whose monumental Dictionary of Spirituality they regularly edited and revised for many decades, and of some of the Society's distinguished members. The company is still based in Paris and claims a specialism in history, religions, spirituality, and philosophy. The translator, Émile Pelletier, being an abbot, had a good qualification for not only understanding the deep religious significance of the text, but also for finding the appropriate terms and expressions in French when the references belong to the religious domain or originate in Bible quotes, phrases, aphorisms, etc. But Pelletier was more than an abbot. He was mainly a fervent internationalist Esperantist, clearly committed to the cause of international brotherhood through the use of a common language, and socially involved on the Christian social, if not socialist, side of French Catholicism. He is still revered as one of the heroes of Esperanto and Aido, a language evolved from a simplification of Esperanto. As Benedict Coss remarked in her own famous article now, Ruskin's writings in general can be difficult to translate due to his obscurity of style and his complex system of quotations. However, there is no specific difficulty with Until This Last, and perhaps to the disappointment of translatologists present here today, the translation is not necessarily the most interesting point here with this book. More significant, I think, is the situation, the setting and framing of the translation itself in a specific ideological context. This is when we have to look at the introductions, editor's notes, and other forewords. The 1902 translation of Pelletier has an introduction de H.J. Brunès. When I looked up the author of the introduction, I was interested to find out that there was no H.J. Brunès. The introduction was the result of a collaborative effort between Henriette and Jean Brunès. It doesn't seem to matter really who recruited whom. Pelletier, the translator, and the Brunesses must have co-opted each other as members or sympathizers of the same social movement, that of the progressive Catholic bourgeoisie bent on social reform. Socially progressive, yes, yet historically conservative, or perhaps even reactionary, since the introduction makes it clear from the first paragraphs that these were anti-capitalist Christians who also criticized the global role of science in the pursuit of legitimacy for the powers of money, in the service of gold, as they put it themselves, to give and confirm to the voracious appetites of the rich the titles of legitimacy. They write in the introduction. I'm not sure how much time we've got left here. Not very long? About 4 minutes. Okay, well, the second translation, then, is the work of Pierre Thiessier and Quentin Thomasy. And they chose the title Il n'y a de richesse que la vie, based on the first translation, on the subtitle of the first translation. In the first version, the introduction explains that this is their favorite expression, something that summarizes best for them the social thought of John Ruskin. Their publishing house is Le Pas de Côté. It doesn't appear, it's... no. It doesn't appear here. Le Pas de Côté, the sidestep, which is an apt name for a voluntary sector association, non-profit organization acting as a publishing house. Thiessier and Thomasy are two former journalism students at odds with the current media world and its race for fast news, email alerts, and news flashes, the instantaneousness of the social media, and so on. There are the two of them, the declared authors of the translation, although I suspect Thomasy is in fact the main translator. But in fact, it probably doesn't matter very much because the translation by Pierre Thiessier and Quentin Thomasy is actually a very close replica of the translation by Pelletier. There are only a few changes and a few adaptations. Political economy is sometimes called the economics, and a few variations in language that are not very remarkable. There is not one mention of Henriette and Jean Brunès in this in their introduction, which is only very short. When the introduction of the Brunès was 33 pages long, theirs is just over 3 pages, and it's not much of an introduction anyway. In order to find more about the interpretation, one has to turn to another book, Les origines de la décroissance, 50 penseurs, which was published recently at the end of 2018. In this, Pierre Thiesset himself explains the importance of Ruskin's social and economic thought for today's degrowthers. In particular, Ruskin's rejection of industrialism and is anti-capitalism, which he finds is the common point between their interpretation, well, their political stance and the political attitude of social Catholics at the beginning of the century. So why so few translations into French, and for that matter, in any other language that until this last has been translated into? The answer to that question had perhaps already been expressed by Ruskin himself in The Crown of Wild Olive in 1866, where, and in particular in the lecture entitled Traffic, which draws the audience's attention to the hypocrisy manifested in the choice of Gothic architecture for their churches, but neoclassical design for their homes. This is perhaps the French intellectual attitude to Ruskin's legacy. While the art critique, the aesthetic considerations, the stylistic genius, etc., have always commanded immense interest from the literati and commenting classes, the preaching and teaching of the great master on the ways of the more material sides of the world seem to have no such appeal. We are ready to contemplate and muse about the fine arts and architecture, but when Ruskin invites us to collectively question our lifestyles and social organization, the iniquity and stupidity of our so-called modern society, we are quick to see Ruskin as too quirky, icky, and possibly cranky. We like to envisage the Gothic as a truer expression of a more authentically human life and society, but will not consider for a second taking seriously the proposition that we should try to radically change our societies to reach the goal of a more authentically human form of life, and Ruskin thought that if we could do this, then we should. What this story of the only 2 translations of Until This Last and these considerations tell us, I think, is the disruptive potential of Ruskin's essential social and political message, if we accept to embrace it, in spite of the limitations of his individual persona and the time gone by since he wrote Until This Last. Yes, I'll try and finish with this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much and to all 3 of you for these very stimulating papers. And well, because we started a little bit late, we won't take too much time for questions. Maybe a few questions, and then we'll have the coffee break, because otherwise we're going to be rushing for the rest of the morning. Does anybody have any question to our 3 speakers? Yes, thank you.
I have a question for Jean-Yves Tizot about Until This Last. I was wondering, well, it's not directly about Ruskin, but do you think that the fact there were 2 translations of Until This Last, one which was made by social Catholics and one by degrowth thinkers, is it just a coincidence? Or might we say that actually there is kind of a religious background of degrowth I mean, of the thought of degrowth, which is not really consciously expressed, but that these two translations might show that. I mean, what are the common points between the two interpretations, or if there is a source? I mean, does it mean that degrowth is a secularization of social Catholicism? That's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you. Possibly there's a form of secularization of social Catholic thought into a contemporary form of anti-capitalism, anti-industrialism. The idea that having faith in something is important. Faith in a cause is important for political and social mobilization. But I think even fundamentally, before this happened, before degrowth took off as a movement, I think fundamentally it's Ruskin's anti-industrialism that's at the core of the link between the two. In the opening paragraphs of their introduction, the Brunesses insist that industrialism and the worship of money and the and applied sciences, the scientific mind, went hand in hand, and that led to the disasters of industrialism in general. And I think this has nothing to do with any religious outlook in particular. I think that's just a basic attitude that they share. If that answers your question.
Well, maybe to continue on the religious aspect, this is something that struck me when listening to your three papers, because even though we were not talking about the religious sources of Ruskin's thought this morning, it is everywhere. In Ruskin's ideal of a brotherhood of men, of brotherhood of workers, as we listen to you first, and also in his work as a teacher with sort of disciples around him. And of course, in his rejection of capitalism, I think there is something that is permanent throughout his writing, throughout his thought, and throughout the many struggles that he experienced in his own religious practice. What do you make of that?
John Rosenberg emphasized how important the gospel idea, workers in the vineyard, was to Ruskin. When I was mentioning the idea of a fraternity of toil, and in a sense, I don't know whether the failure, quote unquote, of the road building is so important. I mean, it was an experience. I'm sure none of those students forgot, and an experience of fraternal labor. But, sorry, just as I said, Ruskin had undergone a religious unconversion, and he never portrayed it in explicitly religious terms.
I don't think you have to consider the experiment a failure. Anywhere, if you teach a course and students get something out of it, but students don't get everything right, it doesn't mean that it's a total failure. I think you did a brilliant job of showing how it was a success and the influence it has had on later approaches to integrating university education. Again, part of this has got to do with Ruskin's emphasis that you learn from experience as well as cognition. I think I forget who it was, but somebody pointed out, a French thinker, but Maritain or somebody, that Ruskin was the first person to emphasize that you could learn through drawing, through the movements of the hand and the eye, and not through thinking about things. And that experience a corporal experience produces knowledge that is a different kind of knowledge, but essential. And it seems to me you've shown brilliantly that the labor together worked in just the same way, and it's an essential part of Ruskin's theory. And that perhaps is why his theory is such a critique of the classical political economists who argue that you can separate one aspect of humanity, and he argues there's no such thing as Homo economicus. They are all human beings are much more complex, and any project has to speak to the complexity. And the road building project was a demonstration of that. Not the fact that there was not a highway at the end of it really was not that important.
Maybe a question for Richard. Maybe the failure aspect of the project is that it didn't really manage to bridge the gap in any way between those students who were from privileged backgrounds and so on, and the people whose daily lives were actually work and toil and etc. And it was just this form of social tourism in a way that it is an experience, of course, but then it's the experience of the onlooker and those who will try their hands at working and walk away with a sense of difficulty, but not maybe the sense of any commitment to changing these situations, which separate, in effect, those who live a life of the mind and etc., and those who live a life of physical labor, or this could possibly be a limitation to this experience.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's the example of Toynbee, and whether it's a direct link from that one experience to his later social engagement, or it's part of a larger series of life events. So there are outcomes that compromise the interpretation of it as a failure or of some sort of social tourism, as you mentioned. Or even look at Wilde. I mean, Wilde was profoundly engaged in the world. And again, you can't say it was just because of this one experience. Nevertheless, there is such a strong social import and political import to Wilde's writings that, I think these larger terms are also ways of looking at them.
Well, I just like to focus on the brotherhood. I didn't mention, but all those pre-Raphaelite teachers, they were teaching voluntarily, so they didn't get paid. Not only did they get paid, they just had to say, donate massive money too. And I just looked into the several memoirs of the former students, and lots of, the Ruskin's, it's totally different because he's a great master. But like Van Jones and the Browns and lots of students said they were treated as a kind of colleagues, or just they didn't use the word like a brotherhood, but they were almost, how can I say, working together. And especially like Rossetti in the class, he just tried many experimental things like a painting. And so basically that he was experimenting so many things as a painter and tried to share the experience with the students. So that's another interesting thing. And about it, as a teacher, Ruskin was, in a way that I was, one of the things I was impressed so much was, one student who was quoted by the Emsley said that, Ruskin was paying attention a lot to each student, and he tried to just, how to say, pick up something which was good about that person. And when he found that, he tried to develop it. Yeah, so, I don't know. In the mass education of 21st century, it's really rare. So while just reading that, how to say, Ruskin himself didn't say a lot of things. He said that he was just against the examinations, and clearly he said in front of the Working Men's College lecture that he's not going to use any kind of the exams. But he said that maybe that, how to say, if I find that somebody who is so good at realizing what I taught, maybe that I might just, how to say, just treat as a kind of the teacher's favorites. Yeah, but that's it. I'm so sorry. That's what he said. So I'm teaching at the university too, you know. So I don't know. I mean, just how to say, doing the research itself just make me change so much as a teacher. It's really interesting experience of learning about Ruskin. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we all share this wonderful experience.